This is a survival tactic, and it's a trauma response, and it often happens really early. It often happens unconsciously.
Autistic masking requires so many more nuanced conversations, as many of us use it to support our needs, but it can also feel so exhausting. Hi, I'm Brett the Audi Boss. I'm an autistic leader with ADHD, and I have over 10 years of leadership training and experience. I am thrilled to be welcoming back Dr. Anna Neff for another conversation this week focused specifically on autistic masking. Dr. Neff is a neurodivergent ADHD and autistic clinical psychiatrist, a researcher, writer, and parent. They primarily work with late diagnosed ADHD and autistic adults, creating mental health and wellness resources tailored to the unique needs of the neurodivergent community. They co-host the podcast Divergent Conversations with Patrick Casal and run the website Neurodivergent Insights and social media channels. They are also the author of Self-Care for Autistic People and the Autistic Burnout Workbook. And that specifically is where we're going to focus today's conversation. There's a whole chapter in the Autistic Burnout Workbook specifically on masking, and that chapter has been very powerful for my unmasking journey and helping through my understanding of autistic masking. We're talking specifically about the emotional landscape of autistic masking and how it begins in childhood and how it protects us and what it protects us from, and also what it costs us. Throughout our conversation, we talk about identity and the complexities of masking. We explored the intersection of identity work and queerness, as well as autistic expression, and the process of unmasking and becoming fully ourselves. I have another conversation we talk specifically about autistic burnout. You can check out that video here. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more of these types of conversations here on my channel. I start off this conversation asking about the masking and unmasking journey and my continued fascination with how we instinctively will mask without even knowing it. Understanding that I was masking and understanding just the concept of masking and that I was unconsciously masking was such a big aha moment that as I pulled on that thread, I was able to go, oh my God, that's autism behind that door. You know, that's where all of that is. So to me, what I think I'm still so fascinated by is how we can at such an early age, how do we find our way into doing that so quickly?
So it's such a good question. First, also just the way, something hit me about the way you talked about masking just now of, can we have more conversations about that? The felt experience of masking and the impact on our psychology, on our identity. I hear it in how you even ask that question. Like it's so often the conversation becomes, is masking good or bad? How do you unmask? Like it's very pragmatic.
Yeah.
But like, can we just sit with, oh my gosh, what is it like to have this thing that we do or much of our life and not have a name for it?
Yeah.
So I'll post it, bookmark it over here for that. To answer the question, this is where I really love the work of Amy Pearson and Kieran Rose, who really shifted the conversation around autistic camouflaging from this like early research, which was done by allistic, non-autistic people, was like, it is a kind of social strategy autistic people use to blend in. Mm-hmm. And that's where Amy Pearson and Kieran Rose were like, no, actually, this is a survival tactic and it's a trauma response. And it often happens really early. It often happens unconsciously. Not for everyone. For some people, it will be a more conscious thing that comes online later. And then, of course, for some people, it never is something they do. Mm-hmm. But I think, especially for those of us who perhaps have a lot of like sensitivity and maybe even rejection sensitivity and who pick up cues around us quite sensitively, we're going to notice those shifts. Like if a parent is harsh with us, or if it's, hey, make eye contact. And if we are punished for our autistic traits, right, the brain is really good at learning. And by learning, I mean, it pays attention to things that are reinforcing and rewarding, and it does more of those things. Yeah. And so at a very young age, especially depending on how we were parented around our autistic traits, we might have learned this is how I stay safe, is by doing these things, by not wiggling when I want to, by forcing myself to do eye contact. And and then it just becomes baked into our psyche. And we assume, and I don't know about for you, but for me, I just assumed everyone was doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that your assumption too?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I can distinctly remember hiding special interests or self-soothing techniques. Like if I was interrupted, if I was like alone as a child, I could like remember that feeling of the tension in my body and locking up and locking something away, not having the language for it at the time, of course, but like I can distinctly remember that and think about that now and just sort of like how important it was to like keep those things safe from others.
Locking your joy away.
Yeah. Yeah, really. That's what it is.
And think about what that does for a person.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you just assume everyone else is doing that too. You talk about in the book sort of that double-edged sword of it is a protective strategy that we adapt to. For many of us, it's definitely there's safety. There's a lot of privilege within that. Mm-hmm. Can you talk through that complexity? We just need so many more nuanced conversations. It's interesting. I actually made an infographic on this when I wrote like a couple years ago when I was working on the digital workbook on masking. I had infographics, and one was privileges or like benefits of masking, and one was costs of masking. Oh my goodness, the responses to my benefits of masking, I just got like kind of pulled through the mud on that one. But it also made something very clear to me that made me very, very sad. The people who were critiquing it were all white. Mm-hmm. And it was just so clear how non-intersectional the autistic space is, mm-hmm. in the sense of like, if you do not realize there's safety in masking, there's privilege in masking. I had a lot of feelings and sadness about it, not just because those were hard comments to receive, but it was a really awakening moment to me and I hear this from my friends and colleagues all the time who are Black and brown in the autistic space around, mm-hmm. like, this is a really hard space to be in. And to me, this is kind of a prime example of that, of how if you're not able to recognize the privilege of masking, then like there's a lot of learning that you still have to do. Yeah. Both around like folks who have higher support needs than you, but also especially around racialized autistic people, mm-hmm. and their experiences. So many privileges, safety, right? Having a meltdown in public, especially if you're Black or brown, can be lethal. Yeah. And we need to be able to talk honestly about that as a community. Yeah. And like access to education, access to jobs, access to like social networks that can help you professionally. That is a huge privilege. I am not going to have eyes perceiving me and looking at me and judging me when I'm in public. That's a huge sensory experience, mm-hmm. to be perceived, especially in a hard moment, or especially in what like we might experience as our awkwardness. That can be very anxiety inducing. So it's also an emotional management system. Yeah. Like, is it more costly to mask, or is it more costly to handle the distress of like people seeing me in a way and then having negative reactions toward me? Yeah. So there's so many privileges that come with masking, and that has to be part of the conversation. And yes, it's a trauma response and a survival response. So it's so complex. And then the cost is very real. So something I often say, and I don't know, I'll decide if I like saying it this way. I might soften this phrase, but something I've said in trainings before is those of us with low support needs tend to have very high mental health support needs. Mm. So those of us who are autistic, navigating neurotypical systems and spaces, substance use, depression, mm-hmm. anxiety, suicidality, like the mental health picture of this group is just so complex, and burnout, right? Because it makes sense. If we are navigating these systems, we're probably holding ourselves to neurotypical standards because we're masking, and then we're less likely to have supports because we're masking, and we're less likely to be identified. So there is very real cost of masking, and mm-hmm. there's very real privileges. And as a community, we've got to be able to hold the tension of that. You do a great job writing in the book about the relationship between code switching and masking. When I've had the privilege of kind of hearing folks who both code switch and mask, like let me into their minds and talk me through it, I'm just like, that sounds so exhausting. Like masking's exhausting
to me. And can you imagine running another system underneath that around code switching, like just cognitively hypervigilance, like how that would live in the body?
Yeah.
That is such a huge labor and burden that so many live with.
It took me a really long time to understand what masking was, and then going through identity work, and then having a lot of ableism wrapped up into that. One of the things you write about that I can't remember exactly the way you put it, but there's this beautiful part in your essay about how there's that moment where something kind of breaks through, that there's something that sort of challenges the everyday for you, that you sort of suddenly see yourself.
For me, well, I'll say for me, the moment I realized I was autistic, and it was fast. It was like my kid and I started talking about it as an option for her. We did a ton of research on autism in girls. And a week later, I remember sitting across from my spouse and being like, I'm autistic and I feel at peace in my body for the first time ever. And because I'd done so much research in that week and like looked through, it was cool because I had a lot of psych data that I could pull through as I was, anyways, besides the point. It was a click into alignment moment for me of until that point. And I was in-depth therapy, like trying to sort out like, is this repressed trauma? Like, what is this? Why can't I get into my life in a way that I want to? Why is my body, like, why do I have such an alien relationship to my body and to desire and to pleasure? And it just clicked. And all of a sudden, 1,000 questions were answered. And it might not be quite that profound for everyone. It might be a more gradual process, but there is something about that breakthrough moment. And then we have language, and then we have names for things. And it unlocks so very much.
Yeah. When I learned the word camouflaging, and I sat with mimicking and copying, all of those things were just sort of like, oh my God, yes, that's a word for that thing that I've been doing for years and years and years. And it's just, you just feel so seen in so many different ways, when you start to put those words to it.
I'm a little nervous to reference this because I maybe don't have it right, but I did a conversation recently with Black Spectrum scholar Callie on intersectionality of ableism and racism. And they introduced me to a term I hadn't heard before, which is hermeneutical injustice. And it's this idea of when we don't have, or a group doesn't have language to describe an experience, and then language will often collectively develop to kind of fill that gap. I want to be careful of what I'd put into that category and not. I don't know if I'd put masking into that, but I do think the felt experience of there is something that on some level, whether it's big T or small t, that feels traumatizing in my body and in how I show up, that I don't understand and I don't have language for. And then when we have access to language for it, it's just so much.
Yeah.
It's like, and I'm curious how do people describe that experience before they access that language? Because I've sat with people for whom, before discovering they were autistic, it's like, I'm a deeply manipulative person.
Yeah.
I manipulate how I like show up to try and get people to like me.
Yeah.
And so the narrative of it is like, well, I'm manipulative.
Yeah.
Right. So what are the other narratives before we have access to the language of camouflaging and masking? What are the narratives we have around this?
I definitely did have different language beforehand. And definitely I was worried it was manipulative. I definitely had those thoughts and go, oh God, I feel like I'm being manipulative. But then I would tie it back to my intent and say, well, I'm not intending to be. So then I would feel guilt over whether or not I was or wasn't, because again, you then end up on this loop, certainly for me, of just sort of looping back and forth with, am I a good person? Am I a bad person? But I'm doing all these things. And then and then you're off.
Well, then throw in the OCD, right?
Yeah.
And this is what like, and I know you follow my Substack, so that like I made a video on this of those neurodivergent woundings, and then the OCD is like, let's infect this and breed on this. So like masking would be a neurodivergent wounding, which many of us wouldn't have language for, of like, I am performative when I'm with people and I like change what my face looks like, or I just stop myself from moving. And then OCD, if we're lucky enough to get that on top of everything, then is going to like have a heyday with that of I'm a bad person.
Yeah.
And that would be such a great example of baseline neurodivergent wounding and then OCD or anxiety just infecting it.
I used to think a lot about the tension in my face when I would smile, because I would have to fake so many hard smiles in so many situations where I knew I was putting on a performance. And then just the relief of not like the literal second that I didn't have to perform, that I could turn my face and let the smile drop and I could just feel those muscles relax. Like I used to think about that all the time before I had language to understand what it was that I was doing.
Oh my gosh. I love hearing this. Like, I love hearing the like details. I know for me, it was like, I had a very professional stance, and I remember from training, like I crossed my legs because I never know what the hell to do with my body. Yeah. And then like, I'd always been uncomfortable. So I'd kind of do this. And then I'd like be telling myself, okay, nod. And then like do the smile thing.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling like, especially about halfway through a conversation, I'd start feeling sick, and I wouldn't know why, but it was just like, I describe it as, I think, sensory sick, but just the coaching myself of what my body should do and not do, and like doing all these things to try to contain it from moving. And then the nodding and the enthusiasm. Yeah. And the like performing interest on my face. I don't miss that.
I know. And I would have, I'm sure you did too, a running checklist of things in my head of just like, oh, there's a conversation point I need to think about, or, there's a thing that I can latch onto, just all that sort of laundry list of things.
What would be on your checklist?
Constantly scanning for a piece of conversation that I could actually connect with somebody on. Like listening intently to go, I don't know what to talk about right now because I'm not a sports person, for example. So listening closely to go, okay, fake your way through this part of the conversation. But the first sign of something you can relate to, latch onto it, hold on to it, pull an anecdote from somewhere in my head, and then see if we can participate in some way in this conversation.
I was always on the lookout for like, shared anchor points. If there was like anything shared in our history, but also, shared ideas. Absolutely. So this also came up in my conversation with Callie, how, again, we have to nuance it so much more. Like, not all masking is bad like that. Yeah. That would be, I think, a like kind of compensation strategy that's probably actually really supportive of like, well, this part of the conversation is harder for me to enter into and access. But if, as I'm listening, I can find anchor access points where I can feel more comfortable, then that would be an example, I think, of like masking or camouflaging where, it's more cognitive effort to do that. And I think it's like important to honor, okay, that's more cognitive effort, but it's also probably like, I don't know that we want to unmask that. That's probably helpful socially.
Oh, and for career wise too, just thinking from a workplace situation, like it's incredibly useful because again, that's where I would run into these narratives of, am I being manipulative at that time? Because it's like, I can apply those strategies in career situations to either keep a conversation going or to keep people feel highly engaged, and it's very helpful. Yeah. So that also, I think, and this is, again, I want to point back to Callie because they were the one that pointed me onto this of when especially if we break down masking into like compensation, assimilation, masking, some of these are compensation strategies that are helpful for us. Yeah. And yes, I think we want to honor, again, the cognitive load of them, but we don't want to just blanketly talk about unmasking as if it's all bad. Like, some of it's like really intentional, thoughtful, strategic compensation we do that supports us in like, I know for me, I feel less anxious if I've scripted out some stuff ahead of time, or if I can find those anchor points. Yeah. Well, and I like to, you've got a great strategy in the book about having a masking plan when you know you need to mask in advance, and just sort of, maybe you could just sort of walk through a little bit of that, how to prepare, and then how to prepare for the day, and then on the day, what we're doing.
Yeah. And this goes back to honoring, like, it's not as simple as good, bad masking, of that masking can be protective. So when we're going into situations where we know like, okay, that's going to be more protective than not, how do I make a thoughtful plan around that? What's my before care going to look like? Can I give myself some downtime before? What's my during care going to look like? Maybe maybe it is thinking through scripts or thinking through kind of rehearsed pieces or identifying, okay, that's going to be a safe person in that context when I'm overwhelmed, or I'm going to step out in this way for 5 minutes. And then having an aftercare plan as well of like, and again, so to do that work, so much of it, we do have to address that ableism of, we do have to like acknowledge something that maybe I believe should be simple to me, like going to this birthday party or this whatnot, is actually really exhausting. And I need before care and I need aftercare.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about that a lot because it's like, I'm going to be late to that event no matter what I try, because that's just a little bit of my baked in before care of like just processing out, different things like that.
So you're going to be late because that helps you, because then you'll be there longer or be there shorter. I
apply what I call the Moira Rose policy of events from Schitt's Creek, where it's twice around the room and then out.
I love that you have such good language for that. That's amazing. So what I was going to say is, and maybe it's different. If it was like, I'm just going to make an appearance to check it off the box, that'd be one thing. But my response is to go early, because if I walk into an event and I'm walking into conversations already happening, I'm walking into a sensory overload. Mm-hmm. My system is really going to struggle. But if I get there early and I can like find my ideal seating, if I can be part of like the early starts of the early conversations, if I can kind of anchor myself in the context, I can warm up a bit.
Yeah.
So my adaptation is to go early. So that was really interesting to me. Your adaptation is to go late.
Yeah. That's fascinating to me because I'm completely with you on the noise and the overwhelm and all the different nuances of that. And at the same time, I want to blend in and I don't want to be seen. So I kind of want to hide in the fabric of the room to sort of like, avoid the conversations I don't want to have. Which is why you
have to get there early to like find a corner to hide out with like your safe people.
I know, but then I'm worried I have to talk to the first people that come in. And I'm like, what if I don't like those people? What if I don't want to talk to those people? What if I have nothing to say to them?
Yeah.
It just sort of, my brain just, I know, I don't want to put new doubts in your head. But
no, totally. That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And it probably does depend on the event, actually.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely depends on the event, because if I have a different role at the event, then I probably don't have a choice. I want to kind of swing into what I think is probably one of the most important things in the chapter on masking. There's this marriage of finding your way into your identity and finding your way into understanding masking can sometimes block us having our needs met or even having an awareness of what those needs are.
It's a huge moment. And it does go back to identity work, right? And it reminds me of even what you were saying earlier about locking away your special interests and locking away your joy. That is essentially what masking does, is like my pleasure, what brings me pleasure and joy, and even the way I move my body, these things are bad. And for safety, I'm going to cue into what other people around me want. And I'm going to deprioritize my signals and prioritize external signals. So if we think both on an identity level, what that does for a person, but also for being able to know our needs and respond to them and to believe they're actually valid enough to respond to, oh my goodness, if deprioritizing my needs for others is what's given me safety, the idea of flipping that can feel really scary and really disarming. So there is so much self-knowledge work and so much learning of self, sometimes at really basic levels of like, what kind of movement do I enjoy? What does feel good? What kind of clothing feels good? And then as we've talked about previously, once you start asking those questions, that can actually unlock a lot of other identity questions. So for me, I sometimes share this. It feels a little embarrassing to share, but I sometimes share, and I didn't actually have language for unmasking yet, but that when I look back, my unmasking started with throwing away lacy undergarments. Because like, first of all, just why the hell would I own that stuff? It's so uncomfortable. It was me like wanting to perform femininity. And then when I threw that away, I was like, wait, what kind of clothes do I like?
Yeah.
And I realized, well, I like things that are soft. I like things that are black and gender neutral. And like wait, how do I feel about this whole she, her thing? And like, and being a woman, and because my mask was very feminine.
Yeah.
So then that journey led me to exploring gender in more nuance and my experience of gender. And so, goodness, I've deviated from your question a lot, but I think it goes back to that question of once we start asking those questions, simple questions of like, what do I like? That can take us on really interesting identity pathways too.
Well, and even within that though, I distinctly remember in my journey in that same path that unconsciously waiting for someone to give you permission. And there's a moment where you realize, oh, wait, it's just me. I'm the one who gives me permission for this. I don't have to I don't like jeans. I've never liked wearing jeans. So like being able to say, okay, I don't have to do that anymore. If I don't want to wear jeans, I'm not going to wear jeans anymore, or, just accepting that it's okay to just give yourself that thing can be quite powerful and it can be quite emotional.
It's how did you get free? It's neuroqueering.
Yeah.
It's, oh my goodness. I can give myself permission to not do this thing or not wear these jeans. And this is where I think the neurodiversity space has learned a lot from the queer space.
Yeah.
It's really been queer people who have taught us how to get free. And then when we adapt that for neurodivergence, I mean, that is neuroqueering to be like, wait, it is okay for me to move and stand and pace and sway and to not wear the jeans and to not wear the lacy underwear and to that's neuroqueering.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I haven't talked a lot about this, but I came out very late for myself. I came out in my early to mid 30s, but I very much can pinpoint that as the beginning of my unmasking process. That when I gave myself permission that it was okay to come out and that I was safe enough to do so. And then as I started to pull on that thread and I got closer to the place where I realized, oh, I'm masking, I'm high masking. I'm going to start to unmask a little bit more and starting to have my needs met and sort of recognizing all the different ways that I was withholding so much of that for myself that it was a floodgate opportunity at that point of things to just start flushing out and just the more, and that's a journey. It takes time. It takes a long time to sort of go through that process, or it did for me. I don't know I'm sure it's different for everybody, but
I mean, I think autistic people can sometimes go through it rapid fire, but it is a long journey. And I like to remind people of that, of like, hey, you've got time.
Yeah.
You've got time. But yeah, once you start queering, it's like all identities get put back on the table. And it can feel overwhelming if it feels like we need to sort this all at once. And so I like what you say of like, it took time because it's delicate work and it honors it when we take our time with it. It's a deeply emotional process, and it's also a relational process because especially if we're doing this in our 30s and we're perhaps already partnered, for example, then how do we bring our partner into those conversations too, in a way that the relationship can metabolize that?
I specifically wrote down the phrasing that you used, meaning making process, and how you then wrote to the need for identity, affirmation, and support and community remains universal. And just sort of like how we begin on that process, that affirmation I feel like that affirmation is everything. When I do identity work, when I've gone through that identity work, suddenly you kind of go back and forth from that self-acceptance to really wanting to be seen, to being really nervous about being seen. But you're looking for that affirmation, and then you're really looking for support and community, and just sort of that juxtaposition of all of those things, and just sort of how it's, frankly, I don't know. For me, it was difficult and continues to be difficult to navigate a lot of that.
I mean, I think you just nailed why, because that's so many complex emotions to hold at once that you just named around, because it is a mixed bag, right, of liberation and shame and confusion. And is this really my identity? The imposter syndrome-ness around the identity that can happen. And this is why, I often say and really believe that neurodivergent community is, I think, the most healing work we can do post-discovery, And I see this in therapists all the time too. They're like, well, I'm working one-on-one with all these folks, but I just want them to talk to each other. And it's because that's like, identity work was never meant to be done in isolation.
Yeah.
It was meant to be done in community. All right. This whole idea of like a buffered self and having an identity that's like located in self, that's not relational. First of all, it's a very wide idea.
Yeah.
But it's also a pretty new idea. Like identity work was always supposed to be about the community. So there's the quote, from Descartes, which captures like Euro-Western thought, which is, I think, therefore I am. And then there's this beautiful phrase that I learned when I was living in Malawi, which is I can't pronounce it. Buntu? Do you know?
I don't know.
Buntu. I think it was the Buntu people, but I might be mispronouncing that. And I believe the quote is, we are, therefore I am, which is so different than I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
So that was a big pivot. But the point is, identity work was always meant to be in community.
Yeah.
Most communities have understood this throughout history. White people are terrible at understanding this.
Yeah.
But when it comes to neurodivergent identity integration, I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that it's best done in community.
I think sometimes I get nervous around that because it's you're letting your mask off. You're taking your mask off to do some of that work, and you are therefore letting your guard down. And there's an element of trust. And I think what tends to come up for a lot of folks when I talk about the unmasking process is, I think there's some all or nothing thinking in there, that we want to be able to unmask fully with the people in our lives. And through that identity work, it sometimes is hard to sort of accept that full self can be on display in that process. So sometimes I try to tell people, well, just unmask a little at a time and sort of see where those boundaries are. And you may not be able to fully unmask around everybody. And if that's what you need in your situation, then that's okay in that situation. Because again, that's, we use that masking for protection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I, first of all, love that thought. Second of all, I know that this can be this might get some pushback. I know it can be hard to talk about, but the reality is a lot of us do have cognitive inflexibility as autistic people.
Yeah.
And so to some degree, and this is a classic way it could show up of, well, I'm either masked or I'm unmasked. And if my partnership is going to be stable, I have to 100% be unmasked. Or if my partner doesn't love me completely unmasked, and that's just, we need so much more space for nuance, because that's, our relationships are really going to struggle if that's the expectation. And I'm even thinking about relational therapists, and how no relational therapist would say, you should say every single thought that ever comes into your mind to your partner.
Yeah.
They're this is just a human thing also, to kind of modulate how much of myself do I show in this moment? And that it doesn't mean we can't be our authentic self if there's parts that we keep private.
Yeah.
And that's not a failing. But I think sometimes when it gets wrapped into that, well, for me to unmask would be to tell you, download all of these things.
Yeah.
That can get us into some tricky waters where we're not thinking about the relational field. We're just thinking about us and unmasking. But what about, I could go on a huge info dump to my spouse every night, but I also want to think through, what's that impact on that relationship and that dynamic, and how's his experience of that when I talk at him for 30 minutes?
Yeah.
I can unmask. It doesn't mean that my partner needs to love every single piece of that. And so maybe I figure out, and this gets back to Esther Perel's idea of the whole, we're now placing on, especially marriages, this idea that you're supposed to be my whole village.
Yes.
Can you make a YouTube channel for your special interest dives? Can you find neurodivergent community where you can talk about these things?
I very much appreciate that specific thought of your partner can't be everything. That's too much pressure to put on your partner. It's too much pressure to put on the relationship. And
we should talk about this, because I think autistic people do that. My world is very small. So I actually do put a lot on my partner, functionally, in regards to how much he holds for me. So that I also love the Esther Perel idea, but then as an autistic person who has a pretty small social network, I do that even more.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that would be an interesting conversation. That idea paired with through a neurodivergent lens.
And when you factor in how we look at pop culture and what the systems of pop culture tell us with what relationships have to be and romanticize those things, we have an early learned experience of, oh, it has to be exactly this. And in my autistic brain, when I thought I was straight, I thought it had to be exactly this. And it took years to work through, no. It doesn't have to be this. It doesn't have to be exactly in that model and in that way. And that's okay.
It is interesting. So I was about to be like, wow, we've diverged a lot. And then here's a through line. This is what unmasking is.
Yeah.
When you start unmasking, it diverges all over the place because all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, it's such a rabbit trail of identity work and so many through lines. So it actually makes, I feel like it's very meta that we've diverged so much in this conversation because that parallels the internal process of unmasking.
Yeah.
Is it takes you in so many different discovery points. So if we can do that with curiosity and compassion, because it is a really complex process of diverging all over the place within our internal landscape and also then in our relational landscape.
And it normalizes. It takes the shame away. It takes all of that away at the same time. If we walk into shame, what's the best way to meet that moment?
I mean, I feel like kind of a broken record. I say this word all the time, but curiosity.
Yeah.
Like, okay, what's coming up around that shame?
Yeah.
Why did that just show up? And I think curiosity is such a good diffuser of shame.
My thanks to Dr. Megan and Anna Neff for their time, for so much time that they spent talking to me today for this conversation. Once again, I loved our conversation. I could talk to Dr. Neff all day about 100 different things. It's just such a joy to talk to them every time. I'm lucky enough to have a conversation with them and learn more about all the different things that they know about and all of the different places where we have shared interests and intersections of all of our combined interests and fascinations. So it's always a pleasure when I can talk to Dr. Neff. Be sure to check out their newest book, The Autistic Burnout Workbook. There's a link in the description below where you can get more information about that. Be sure to also check out their website, Neurodivergent Insights, and their Substack as well. All of those links below, including a link to Neuroqueer, which is something that Dr. Neff mentioned in our conversation, and a link to their other book, Self-Care for Autistic People as well. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Please leave a comment below if there's a topic or an issue for something about ADHD or autism in the workplace you'd like to know more about. Thanks for watching and listening, and please be sure to check out some of the other topics here on my channel.